Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar of Etnofoor and Neva. My name is Wigbertson Julian Isenia, and I'm the editorial member, board member of Etnofoor. And I will be opening this webinar today and then also handing it over to our moderator. This webinar is the third of its kind. And as I said before, it's a joint organization between Etnofoor and Neva. So Etnofoor is a Netherlands-based journal that publishes peer-reviewed articles twice a year on a particular theme. And we've been working with Neva for quite a while right now. And Neva is the Netherlands Association for Anthropology. So if you're a member of Neva, you will also get an issue of Etnofoor every time that is published. So if you're interested in becoming a member, you can also sign up. So if you go to the website antropologen.nl, you get to sign up and become a member. Just to inform everyone, this webinar will be recorded and will appear on the YouTube channel of Neva. But also you will be able to rewatch it this session later. So we are gathered here on the occasion of this new issue on the themes of archives. It's a very beautiful publication. And you can also read it online or order the physical copy. And this special issue was edited by Gijs Kremers, Noor Blaas, and myself, Wigbertson Julian Isenia. So this special issue revolves around archives, and it approaches archives in an anthropological sense. So it tries to unpack what that might mean in our scholarly work. And so here we imagine archives as actual archives, so bricks and mortar buildings and infrastructures, but also how scholars have described archive as a more abstract, but no less real archives between our ears. So what we imagine, how we see ourselves, and what we remember, and what that means for how we also maneuver the world. So for today, we selected 3 articles from this special issue and invited their authors to present them. And we also have the pleasure of having an archivist here. And so for everyone who has done archival research, archivists play a vital role in our research. So they support our work as researchers, and more broadly, they preserve these historical materials. So we want to think about questions that perhaps unsettle the binary between archivist and researcher, and imagine other ways of collaborating and preserving together. So I will briefly introduce all speakers who will be introduced properly later by the moderator. So the speakers are Caroline Nede, Daantje van der Linde, Nina Andro, Nicola Lekkenby, and Roen Sassen. Also, these presentations will be followed by a discussant, Christine Krause. And finally, our moderator for this webinar is Elisabeth Rush. Elisabeth Rush is an associate professor at Wageningen University. Her research topics include indigenous mobilization toward neoliberal policies and extractive projects, and energy production in Latin America, so Guatemala, Colombia, and Chile particularly, and the Netherlands. Her current fieldwork in Guatemala focuses on how territory defenders experience violence and criminalization. And so without further ado, please help me welcome our moderator, Elisabeth Rush.
Thank you so much for this introduction. And I just realized when I had sent my bio to Noor that, of course, in this role that I have today, I should also have added that I'm the chair of the NEVA, of the Dutch Anthropology Association, because that's in that position that I am sitting here chairing this or moderating this webinar. And I think Noor already put the link in just to promote our association a little bit, a link in the chat if you want to become a member. Yeah, so it's an honor for me to host this webinar. I look very much forward to hearing the presentations, but I won't dwell too long on how happy I am. I just want to move forward and introduce the first speaker, who is Rune Sassen. She studied anthropology and cultural history in Utrecht, and now she works at the Utrecht Archives, at the gemeente Utrechts Archief, here in the municipality of Utrecht. Rune, you have 10 minutes, and oh yeah, what I should also say is that each presentation has 10 minutes, and after 6 minutes, I would just say 6. So also for the people just listening, and then when the 10 minutes are over, I will say stop, so that you can still finalize your sentence, but you should then really move towards closing your presentation. So Rune, the floor is yours. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint to share, or maybe you are just presenting. The floor is yours.
Let's see. I will quickly share my screen. There you go. Oh. Let's see. I haven't done this in quite a long time. There you go. I hope this is visible and clear for everyone. Well, my name is Rune Sasse, and as already was said, I studied cultural anthropology and master's in cultural history afterwards. I am not an archivist, by the way. Just to make that clear, I have never done any archival studies, which is in its own right very different from history. So I am a historian, but I am not an archivist, and this is quite an important distinction to make right at the beginning. So what do? I am an informatiemakelaar in Dutch, literally translated into information broker. What that means exactly, I will come back to later. And also a quick disclaimer, due to personal reasons, I haven't actually been doing that specific job for now a half year. I won't go into the reasons why, but just to make sure I haven't, let's just say, I am not speaking, I am my own person, so I'm not representing the Utrecht Archives in any way. I'm just talking as an anthropologist working in the field of archives. And that's why I'm here today. And from that position, I will be speaking, but not as someone who is working at the Utrecht Archives, just to make that clear. All right, starting. I'm not going to give an in-depth explanation or a definition of what an archive actually is, but I want to first differentiate between two meanings of archive, because the archive can be explained as an institute. So I work at the Utrecht Archives, at Utrecht Archief, as an institute, the big brother organization. In Dutch, we call that archiefbewaarplaats or archive repository. And you have in the Dutch archival world, you have a few different kind of archives like this. So you have regional historical centers like het Utrechts Archief or the various provincial archives, and you have the national archives from a national perspective, but you have also thematical archives like IDEA, which is an archive around LGBTQ plus histories, ATRIA for women's histories, and the Black Archives in Amsterdam. And the other meaning of archive, which I come across in my field of work, is the archive as a collection. So you have I still work at an archive, but within that archive or archive repositories, you can find various archives or collections, like your local sports club, for example, or the archive of the municipality. The Utrecht Archives holds 1,400 collections, which in archival terms we express in kilometers. So, for example, like the Utrecht Archives holds 35 kilometers, and I feel like 8 of these boxes they are 1 meter. So that sort of can signify how much that actually is. So and we only have paper archive, so no objects, no physical 3D objects, only 2D material. So that's might be interesting. So what kind of archives can you find at the Utrecht Archives? Well, why do we have archives? Let's begin with that. There is a Dutch Archives Act, the Archiefwet, in which it was wait, let me sip. Take a sip of water there. The Archiefwet was created so that there is a kind of structure to what municipalities need to keep. It isn't that important, but it's interesting to know that everything the archives do actually have to fit a kind of framework, because well, some archives, the archives need to fit within a kind of framework. It's just and there is a structure to it. There is structure to what needs to be in a specific inventory. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry if people don't have any archival research, because then it can be quite a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm not really having my talk in order. I'm sorry. But what can you find at the Utrecht Archives? You can find state archives, like municipal or provincial archives in the Utrecht Archives. Noticeable, interesting is also that you can find court archives, like adoption papers or divorce papers. So this is quite recent information as well. You can also find church and missionary archives, like the picture I have included, which come from the Zeist missionary organization, the Zeister Zendingsgenootschap. They've done a lot of missionary work in Suriname, and there are a lot of pictures that can be found in the Utrecht Archives as well, even though it's quite hard to find, but we'll come back to that. You can find the archives of the Dutch railways, or family archives, and mainly nobility. But there's also a lot of private archives, particuliere archieven. It's, to me, as an anthropologist working in the archival field, these are the most well, it depends on your research, of course, but these holds to me the information that people find the most interesting. Let's put it like that, because the private archives are like the local archives of the your sports club or their community center or something like that. And it is important to note that under the Dutch Archives Act, these are not, we are not required to keep those. We just choose to keep those as well, because we or the Utrecht Archives finds those to be valuable, or sometimes even more valuable to like the bigger picture of keeping records.
6.
Yes.
4.
So what is my job? I help with research through calls, email, chat, and in our reading room in the studiezaal. And those questions can range between anywhere between finding adoption papers to charters or oorkonde from the 13th century. So it's a very broad questions we can get. So the main problem is accessibility and findability of information, because, well, let's just say the archives aren't objective. That's, I think, quite generally accepted today, also within the archival world. But that isn't even the main issue that I come across. The main issue is tackling archival structure and maybe archaic language as well, and translating them to questions that people actually have. So in that sense, I need to understand both the collection and the citizen or the person asking the question, and bridging the gap between the archive and the real world. And that maybe sounds a bit weird, because archive should, I think, reflect the real world, but it just doesn't, because the archives are constructed within, like, starting from the 19th century, and that's just been added to, maybe sometimes updated a little bit, but mostly kept the same. So some challenges I face in my everyday work is, like I said, the myth of the objective archive, but also searching and finding. Just when, for example, when you search for the word bike on our website, you won't find results for bikes. So that's also a big problem. There are certain wildcards you can use, but you need to know that before you start actually searching. So you need to sort of understand the archival way of searching for information before you actually start doing it. And you need to be aware of that before you start searching. Otherwise, you won't find the information you're looking for. Like I said, the archival structure versus the questions of the public. That also there is a big discrepancy between the two. And some organizations and people are more likely to find the archive. So that's also a big problem, I feel like. I feel like that's what I actually wanted to say. Maybe it's time for a different approach. What I meant by that was, I feel like the archive has been very passive, and being like on this ivory tower the whole time. And I feel like it's maybe time for the archive to get down from the ivory tower and actually meet people. And I think it's time for that, but I don't think we're there yet. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rune. It was very interesting insight into your work as an anthropologist in the archive. I now want to introduce our next speaker. We have time for a Q&A at the end when everyone has already spoken, so not in between. And our next speaker is Nina Andro, and Nina is a historian. She works at Maastricht University on topics as colonial history, memory studies, spatial justice, histories of racial inequality, and Southern Africa. So quite an interesting range of topics, and a very, interesting for this archive, I would say, for this webinar on archives. Nina, the floor is yours, and you are already sharing your screen.
Thank you. And I think it's a very good follow-up to everything Runa just said, because my topic is very much on how marginalized communities create and preserve their own archives outside of the formal institution of the archive. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very happy to be presenting my Etnofoor contribution, Barbershops and Mosques, Informal Community Memory Centers and Marginalized Histories in Stellenbosch, South Africa. Like I said, I'll be discussing how the marginalized colored communities of Stellenbosch perpetuate their own historical narratives despite ongoing historical marginalization and invisibilization. And one important note I just want to make clear before I start, I use the racial identifier of colored strictly within the South African sense. I'm very aware that it has very different connotations in other national contexts. In South Africa, it refers to people of mixed racial and cultural heritage and doesn't have any negative connotations. So moving on. The town of Stellenbosch, my lovely hometown. Stellenbosch today, maybe some of you have been there, is very famous for its colonial architecture, its Cape Dutch style architecture, as well as the winelands surrounding it. It's a very good university, and at just about an hour from Cape Town, it's really a tourist hotspot at the moment as well. It was founded in 1679 as the second oldest town in South Africa on the land of the indigenous Khoi and San people, and since then has always been home to an extremely mixed population. From the beginning, it was inhabited by European settlers, enslaved people from Asia and further north in Africa, as well as indigenous people and people of mixed descent. However, you would be forgiven for not recognizing this or not realizing this if you were to walk around the town today. Stellenbosch has a rather negative reputation in South Africa for being an Afrikaner stronghold and very much a white town. I've had several Black friends tell me that Stellenbosch was the only place in South Africa that they were made to feel unwelcome. And like I said, this very diverse heritage of all these different groups of people that have lived in this town since it was founded have been purposefully erased and continue to be invisibilized. And this is largely also due to the spatial and urban engineering which took place under apartheid. So, like I said, until pretty recently, the 1970s, Stellenbosch was a very racially diverse commercial hub. But after the implementation of the Group Areas Act, which became a law in 1950 and was implemented in the 1960s and 1970s in South Africa, this changed. The Group Areas Act was implemented by the apartheid government and basically designated particular neighborhoods for different race groups to live. So that would be Black, colored, or white people. And once an area was declared a group area with the best, most arable land reserved for white people, and then a sort of sliding scale within the racial hierarchy of apartheid, the local municipality or government had the power to demolish all the houses and displace everyone who was not of the designated group. And this took place in Stellenbosch as well. Central Stellenbosch was declared a white group area, and after that, about 3,500 colored people, so more or less half of the central town area's population, was forcibly removed to the periphery. Now, this law, even though we've been a democratic country since 1994, very much still shapes the urban landscape and social interactions within the landscape of Stellenbosch. So you can see here the two peripheral areas where Stellenbosch's colored communities were removed to, Clutisville and Idas Valley, and where most of the town's colored populations still reside. While the center of the town, like I mentioned earlier, remains a very decidedly white touristic space. In the areas where these colored communities used to live, there remains no trace of them. The municipality has never formally acknowledged the removals that happened. Hundreds of family homes were demolished to make room for parking lots. Spaces of worship were repurposed for white use, such as this church in the upper right-hand corner, which today houses a predominantly white congregation. And historical houses that were worth something at the time were sold to the highest white bidder. There has been 1 or 2 books written about this, but like I said, these episodes remain like pretty much completely unknown within the public awareness of, or like the public historical sphere in Stellenbosch. So this is the background of what my project wanted to address. And it became especially urgent for me as a researcher to find out more about this, considering the demographic makeup of Stellenbosch, which to this day consists of more than 50% colored people. So I wanted to create a digital public history project in which I would combine archival visual research with digital geotagging technology to visualize the urban landscape of the town before apartheid's social and spatial engineering changed it. In doing so, I wanted to increase the historical visual representation of this group, as well as create an accessible alternative historical record to the current Eurocentric historiography. When I began with my archival research, I ran into rather predictable conundrums. As these wonderful authors, Derrida, Trouillot, and Stoller have written, archives are never neutral. They reflect the biases of their creators and thus often exclude or only show slivers of marginalized groups within these societies. And this was very much the case I found in the archives of Stellenbosch, which, when they depicted colored people at all, portrayed them in very stereotypical roles, almost always in subservient positions to white people, thus reflecting the apartheid and colonial mentalities of the archives creators. So once I was there and realizing I had to sort of rework my project a little bit, I started reaching out to colored friends as well as researchers at Stellenbosch University to gain access to gatekeepers who were kind enough to share with me photographs from family collections, from private collections, and from different spaces, which gave me a whole different perspective, obviously, on this history. And most importantly, how this history was represented by them and for them, so on their own terms. From this, I created this lovely interactive digital map, which is online. There'll be a QR code at the end, as well as created an interactive story map with additional archival material and contextualization. But the most interesting finding out of all of this, which I also wrote about in Etnofoor, was the existence of what I term informal community memory centers. These spaces within the urban landscape where these communities maintain their memories and also pass them on to the next generation through social, material, and spatial means. All these spaces had really significant implications for these community identities. You would often see people of all age groups, elderly people bringing grandchildren there to learn about this history, which is nowhere officially represented. And again, these spaces did not conform to any of the normal structures that we think of when we think of archives. As Runa said, archives don't reflect the real world, and that was very much the case I found with these stories. So the 2 spaces which I wrote about in the paper were Arts Barbershop in Ida's Valley and the Khujatul Islam Mosque in central Stellenbosch. For both of them, the location was relevant. Arts Barbershop is now being run by the 3rd generation after Faisal's grandfather had to leave central Stellenbosch after the implementation of the Group Areas Act. And again, he started collecting photographs upon his removal to sort of memorialize these communities, and patrons have caught on, and the whole shop is full of images. And a lot of the people who come there come for a lot more than just a haircut. They come to reminisce and chat about sports teams and history, and it's a very, very social space. Likewise for the Khujatul Mosque. This mosque is really special because it's one of the last remainders of these communities you can actually find in central Stellenbosch. But whereas the communities that worship there used to live around it, nowadays they need to commute in. The mosque featured really prominently in a lot of memories that I discussed with interviewees because it is one of the last physical reminders of the community that used to live there. And as well, inside the mosque, you can see a lot of photographs, religious rituals linking this contemporary community to their officially erased history. Out of all of this, the biggest takeaway for me was that I was trained traditionally as a historian. I was trained to do archival research and textual analysis. Yet when I was on the ground in the field, I had to become an ethnographer in real time, after realizing just how little official archives contained about the communities I wanted to study. I was really not adequately trained for this, and in retrospect missed out on a lot of opportunities to record impressions and ethnographic data. And I was also unprepared with the positionality and ethical aspects of doing this research. And I had to figure it out as I went along. There were also some issues to do with ethics of representation, especially with myself being a white researcher going into these colored spaces, which, even though I grew up in the town, I'd never entered into. For example, these two photos here, the dapper gentleman on the right, one interviewee told me he was a trader, someone else told me he was a well-known marijuana smuggler. And we had a very funny conversation afterwards about the ethics of, or the dilemmas of representing your ancestors and your community in the best possible light to outsiders like myself. And to take away the project and sort of the 2 years after the project, during which I've remained in contact with all my interviewees. You can see me here with Faisal the barber holding my article in Etnofoor, has really driven home to me that, especially as a historian wanting to research marginalized group, collaboration and interdisciplinary training is key. And that it's only by doing this that we can really start to challenge the epistemic violence, which so often continues to be present, especially in post-colonial contexts like South Africa. And yeah, by doing so, we can really increase the awareness and recognition of such informal community-driven archives so that researchers can listen to and work with these people instead of continuing to speak for them, as has so often happened in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was really inspiring also to hear about this intersection of with ethnography and being a historian. Okay, so thank you for that. As I said before, questions can be asked towards the end of the webinar, so write them down if you have one. The next speakers or speaker, I don't know if you are presenting with the two of you, but it's Caroline Nede and Daantje van der Linde. Caroline works at the UC Louvain-Saint-Louis in Brussels, where she does research on the possibilities and limitations of the legal framework surrounding colonial collections in Belgium. And she also worked as a researcher at the Wereldmuseum. Daantje is a cultural historian who also works as a researcher at the Wereldmuseum, where she studies its Africa collection. And she holds an MA degree in African Studies from Leiden University and in museum studies at the University of Amsterdam. So do you have a PowerPoint or are you just presenting like it is?
Yes, we have a PowerPoint.
And where are you? Ah, there you are.
I will share my screen.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction. We will present, Caroline and I will present together. Thank you for the team at Etnofoor for organizing the webinar with the Netherlands Association for Anthropology. We're both really happy to join here. We're looking forward to the conversation after the presentations. We both worked as, and I still work as a provenance researcher at the World Museum in Rotterdam. In our article, we try to show how archives, how they can be used when doing provenance research into colonial collections at museums. The museum is a municipal museum with a collection of around 80,000 objects, which were largely collected during the 19th and 20th century. You can see the building on the picture on the left, on the top. When doing provenance research, the questions that are usually asked relate to the idea of involuntary loss of possession, which is also in line with Dutch policy on restitution. So from whom was an object taken? Do you even use the word object? Under what circumstances was something collected? Who collected it? And so forth. And in trying to look for these answers, we mainly rely on European archives when doing this work. And while these are important questions, we do think that this specific approach risks presuming the traceability of ownership of objects, but also the neutrality of archival records as places to turn to for proof. And in our article, we propose an alternative way of engaging with archives when doing this type of provenance research. We believe this research should be about questioning the institutional and epistemic conditions under which objects were collected to better understand the context in which the collecting took place in the on the first hand. It should be about uncovering systemic silences and inaccuracies in both the archive as well as the museum collection. And on the one hand, this requires attending to archival silences, reading them again along and against their grain, which is in line with the work of Anne Stoller, but it also should work towards filling these silences. This requires alternative research methods, as archives in themselves are often unable to do so. And ultimately, this approach means moving away from an extractive engagement with archival records, but rather introduces an ethnographic engagement with them. And on the photos here, you can see an example of where we look for archives. And on the right is a picture in the depot of the museum where the part of the collection is stored, to give you an idea of the places where we work as well. When we started this work 3 years ago, we noticed the need to better understand which archives were kept within the museum before we could even start to work with them in the first place. Part of the records are stored at the Rotterdam City Archives. The other half, however, we found stored away in old moving boxes scattered across the various museum buildings. And you can see an example in the photographs here, which are stored in the basement of the museum. The often poor state in which they've been preserved in the past is due to a lack of structural care and institutional continuity. Hardly any document had been properly inventoried until 2 years ago, nor has anything really been digitized, and it's not uncommon for things to have gone missing in the past.
And next to internal archives, we engage with external institutions such as the National Archives in The Hague, that, for instance, hold archives of the Nieuw Afrikaanse Handelsvernootschap, which was a Rotterdam-based company that was active in West Central Africa. And employees of this company brought together a collection of around 6,000 objects for the Wereldmuseum. So the archives in The Hague are relatively well described and accessible, but we find it important because it came across in our research to highlight that this is not the case for many other European archives. Colonial archives in France, Belgium, the UK, and Germany are characterized by secrecy and neglect on a chronic and structural level. And the phenomenon of displaced archives, in which colonial archives were hidden, burned, sunk, or lost at the dawn of independence, has been well described in the past years. In the case of Belgium, for instance, 6 kilometers of public archives were shipped from Congo to Belgium just before independence. And a large part of these archives remained classified and therefore inaccessible until 2017. And after 40 years, they are now becoming gradually organized, inventoried, and studied. But questions of accessibility remain due to visa politics as well as internal Belgian problems, and these problems continue to feed feelings of secrecy and neglect. Yeah. So once we identify the necessary archives, we work to read these archives against and along the grain to unpack colonial epistemologies that continue to frame people and their material culture till this day. And one of the two cases we highlight in our paper, in our article, shows that a transnational approach can be helpful in going against the grain. It was pointed out to us by the Belgian archivists that a Dutch agent called Everhard van der Hees, who was active in the Congo region on behalf of the New African Trading Company, was convicted by the court-martial of the Congo Free State for violence against indigenous people around 1900. And you can see the cover page on the left. And it was an interesting file because there were also witnesses from indigenous voices. And we were able to then combine this information with informations in the archives of The Hague, and could eventually identify this man as a collector of a historic outfit in the Wereldmuseum collection. There had not been information on these the items that you see here, and the information that we could retrieve in the Rotterdam Stadsarchief in the City Archives of Rotterdam was never actually addressed or used in the internal database. So the internal database we had was empty, and it had not been linked to the. Okay, thank you. It had not been linked to the person of Van Hees. So the fact that this had not been on the radar is no coincidence. It is an outfit that was attributed to an Arabic slave trader, as you can read in the correspondence below. Culture of Arabic people in Congo was displayed as peripheric to the real Congo. So Eastern material culture was displayed for a very brief moment in time in the Netherlands, during which an imaginary rift was created in European minds between East and Central Africa on both sides of Lake Tanganyika, and this division helped to frame male Muslim men from East Africa as foreign invaders, which was an image that helped to bring a civilizing mission from the Belgian side. And this image was strengthened by a large amount of hippo hide whips, known as chicots as well, that were donated to the Wereldmuseum as well. These chicots were later associated with red rubber in the Congo Free State, but at the time they were attributed to Arabo-Swahili slave traders. And so the narrative that was pushed by the Congo Free State and Leopold II was also spread in the Netherlands by NHV agents and the museum itself. This case shows how you can read archives both along and against the grain in doing provenance research, along the grain and by combining research, by combining its sources. We found stories of colonial violence that took place on a small scale, whereas it's usually big scale violence that is portrayed in research. And it confirms that the museum actively engaged with and even paid violent individuals to collect outside of formal Dutch colonies. Reading these same archival records against their grain then allows us to be critical of the creation of the image of Central Africa and its material culture. And the combination of reading archives along and against the grain attends to archival silence as visible and redirects attention to objects that were otherwise forgotten. Thank you.
Impressive time management, everyone. Less than 10 minutes. So thank you so much. It was also really, really interesting and inspiring. And now I would like to introduce Nicolas Lakenbu. And I think you don't have a PowerPoint, right?
That's correct. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's just fine. I was just like, so no screen sharing and everything. So Nicolas is a social anthropologist, and he works as a honorary research fellow in the Department of Anthropology at the University College in London, where he explores the interconnections between historical consciousness, kinship, and ethical life in Serbia, Bosnia, and more recently in US South. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me and for having me here. It's lovely to be part of this. So no, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I do have a few little comments. I doubt it will take 10 minutes. So I suppose the first thing I'd say is that I don't work in archives per se. I've never really done archival research in that sort of classic sense. But I am an avid collector. I'm an obsessive collector of little things, papers and documents. And my initial fieldwork back, it was quite a while ago, but for the PhD, was in Serbia. And I was very interested in religious life, belonging, peoplehood. And perhaps we know the feeling as when you start some research and you feel that you're not getting any data. And so I found it very satisfying to collect various paper cuttings, leaflets, receipts, anything that came my way. Then I felt like I sort of had it. So, I mean, I whipped a few things out of my archive now. Like I've got like parish newsletters, which are very nice. I've got a lovely card which says happy 7,530, which would be the year we'd be celebrating if we were counting from the creation of the world. And that was given to me by a guy on the street. I've got a horoscope magazine, for example, with predictions for 2021. Very few of them turned out to be true. I've got, for example, a little tract on whether tattooing is a sin, and you won't be surprised to know that it is, obviously. A little invitation for a sort of religious procession, which I sort of marked on the back, religious calendars, postcards, and so the list goes on. I'm not going to bore you with every item of my collection. The point is that, I suppose, in my fieldwork practice, I've worked with people who always feel very papery people, right? Who are always thrusting things into my hands, drawing things, or giving me self-published books. When I came back from my initial fieldwork, I actually had a separate suitcase just filled with like paper that I sort of dragged onto my flight. So that would be my sort of opening gambit. But the inspiration for this article was actually when the departmental manager at my university, I think, was getting slightly concerned about the sheer amount of paper under my desk. And the time came, I think, for some of it to head to the recycling bin. And as I was going through this, I thought, well, this is an archive. This is an archive that I've been producing for the past 10 years. And there's loads and loads of stuff piled up here. And around that time, I was fortunate enough to see the Malinowski lecture, which was given this year by Chikab Al-Khahab. I'm not sure whether anybody has seen it. It is available online, and I would encourage all of you to watch it. It's brilliant. And in his lecture, he encourages us to think about the ethnographer's archive and to think through all of those little photographs, those things we collect, and to think about their temporalities, right? And the way that socio-historical context starts to swirl around them. And that these things we collect, even if it was 10, 20 years ago, are always in some way useful. Anyway, he puts it very eloquently, and I'd encourage you to watch the lecture, and I think it will be published in due course. And so with that in my mind, I went back to my enormous pile of papers, and I started to think of it as my own little ethnographer's archive. Like any archive, as others have suggested, completely subjective, completely based on the things that I was interested in. These are random bits of paper. If you've read the article, some of these things were going to be discarded by my informants. They thought they were rubbish or unholy, and I was sort of keeping them. But sitting back in my office, I started to see all sorts of connections that I hadn't seen before. I never really thought about the fact that these women and men that I was hanging out with were so keen to draw stuff for me. That in itself is interesting. It was like I would ask them a question and they would reach for paper and pen. Or, you know, that people were so keen to give me some sort of document. Oh, I'm going to get, people go and photocopy me stuff from the photocopy shop. And so I really started to think about that. And so that's the crux of the article. If you're interested, you can read it. I hadn't realized, for example, that one man really enjoyed writing stuff with a fountain pen, but then I saw various different documents that were written in his fountain pen. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So to sort of sum up, I realized that my collection is very culturally specific. Serbian Orthodox love paper. They love pamphlets, and this is a thing. This is a cultural phenomenon. And I'm also aware that perhaps my approach to field work differs. You know, I'm at UCL. there's a massive emphasis there on digital anthropology, etc. And I'm very much in the, come on, I write with a typewriter, you know, I'm very much in the analog mode here. But I suppose the broader invitation of my article was that I was sort of thinking, what other things do other field workers collect? So not necessarily like random postcards, but if you're doing an engaged long-term bit of field work, we're all accruing things, perhaps ideas, perhaps, I don't know, pencils or paper clips, I don't know. So I suppose my invitation was to think about what are those things we accrue that might seem to be banal, that might seem to be foolish, but how might those things or ideas or images or texts or bits of string, how might those things might actually be useful after the field work? When you've left the field site, how might those things actually give you some new insights into the societies where you were working, into the people that you met, into their values, into the way that they perceived past and future. So I'm not suggesting that everybody collects like little orthodox calendars, but I do think there's something to be said for looking back at all that stuff that we collect and wondering, without actually going back to the field, how that might generate new ideas and new questions. So with that, I shall leave it. Thank you. And thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, that's even before my 6-minute sign. Thank you so much. As a papery person myself, I could really relate to your. Yeah, I feel like going through all my ethnographic archives myself now.
Oh, you should. You should.
So thank you so much for that. Did we already applause for Nicolas? So now we have heard all the presentations. So the next that I would like to give the floor to is Christine, I think it is, Krause, who is a professor of, now I have to read this right, of anthropology, health and care at the University of Amsterdam, where she directs the research group Healthcare and the Body, which is dedicated to making university academia a friendlier place. And now she's in the lead of a project that's called ReloCare, in which she and her team investigate care outsourcing to Central and Eastern Europe. Christina, thank you so much for acting as a discussant for this in this webinar, and the floor is now yours. And you also have 10 minutes.
Yeah, thanks so much for this opportunity and for this invitation. It's a real honor. And you might all wonder why somebody working on care and health, what is the relation to the notion of archive? And that is a very good question, because I have been approaching this volume of Etnofoor as somebody interested to think with the archive, in particular care homes as archives, but not as an expert at all. And it's actually Julian's fault, because he kind of put me on that track. And after he had inspired me, he could twist my arm to function as discussant. And I read all your articles with great interest and pleasure. And also now listening to your presentations was wonderful. And also to see this visual material also, and also the real stuff by Nicolas, which didn't fit into the journal, even though the journal has some pictures. So from this position of like also a beginner of thinking with the notion of the archive, I'm really humbled by this volume, which so clearly and interestingly presents vivid and very original engagement with the long-standing conversation around the archive. And this is, of course, always a conversation, and all of you made that very clear, to talk about that, what is silenced, what is not represented in the archive. It always means to talk about the limits and the constraints, and that is also made very clear in the very clear introduction by Noor, Gijs, and Julian. And for readers interested in questions of archives and memory, this special issue is really a fantastic way to learn more about the field, because the case studies are so very different So some focus on archives or archival materials in the traditional sense of the word. So by this, like already also what we heard, like physical objects, documents, notes, pictures, recordings, which are kept somewhere and constitute inheritances and legacies of the past. And in engaging with these objects, the authors exercise all the tools available in studies of the archive and the archival turns, in particular, which has also been mentioned a lot, reading with and against the grain, the famous notion by Anne Stoller. With the grain, meaning understanding the archive's internal logic, its categories and its intentions, and against the grain, interrogating its biases, exclusions, and ideological work. And what all these approaches unite is the insight that archives are never neutral. This has also been said already. They represent specific legacies which are imbued with residues of power relations. But then we also have some contributions which focus on not so obvious archival sites. They find archives in city spaces, like the article by Nina, in art forms, embracing also a wider understanding of the archive, which includes ephemeral practices, those that resist traditional documentation, scrapbooks, postcards, protest signs, but which carry a lot of social and emotional textures, but also kind of fleeting things like performances or embodied practices. And these all blur the line between archive and environment and suggest that archives are not just places to store knowledge in, but they are places we live in and interact with. And this notion of interaction is one I really want to highlight and I want to say more about, together also with the notion of the finding aid or the findability, which Rune also kind of like mentioned in the beginning. So one of the examples of these more ephemeral understandings of the archive is the article by Rachel Matthew, the piece on Within Reduction, who looked at reduction practices in the artwork of Palestinian diasporic artists, whom she's reading with, among others, Saidiya Hartman's ideas about how to revisit but not replicate grammars of violence in archiving practices. Or Peter Duplessis' article on reading the cultural archive in het South Africa House, which is a cultural and knowledge center about South Africa, which was founded in the 1920s. And that is a very interesting article where he kind of offers a spatial and object-based reading of a very specific room in that house. And by doing that, he traces how whiteness is maintained. Whiteness, in particular, between the Boer Afrikaners and Dutch people. And he does that by reading the objects in the room contrapunctually, a phrase by Edward Said, of his, and he's also relating to Gloria Wecker's term of the cultural archive. And he kind of basically tries to reconstruct the cultural archive around that house. And he places the objects in a wider network. And these networks can also be indirect. And he kind of evokes those networks by combining the objects in the room with photographies, like this kind of juxtaposing of different archival objects, what we have also heard Dante and Caroline doing in their research. So what is happening here is that the archive is then read with two simultaneous frames of attention, holding dominant and suppressed histories together at the same time. And by that, reading what the archive explicitly say and but what it cannot or refuses to say. So that means the archive is read polyphonically, hearing the dominant voice, but also the submerged, resistant, or erased voice. This is also something which comes back in another article I found very impressive by Enzo Hamel. He brought back Gregory Bateson's, by the way, also the husband of Margaret Mead, at least for some time, the laminated photographs and notebooks from Bateson from the research in the 1920s and 1930s to Papua New Guinea. And he met the grandchild and the closest informant of Bateson, called Casper. And what he then develops is a kind of listening to the archives. And he mobilizes a notion by Tina Kemptz, who is actually a visual scholar, and who has developed this notion as listening to the photos, listening to the moment when the photo was taken, when the voices were made quiet through the shutter of the camera. And he kind of applies this two moments of when voices were recorded. And what he does is that he's reading the field notes of Bateson to people today who are the grandchildren. And by that, the archive becomes a dynamic space where knowledge is not so much assessed, but constantly reassessed and renegotiated and reproduced and interacted with. And by that, he intervenes in the dead end of pointing only to the violence of the context of production, which has been a very important point in archival studies, thinking on with Foucault and Derrida, but opens up this space where you can listen against the grain. This kind of idea that the archive is basically enacted in interaction is also what I find so fascinating about Nina's article, because like what you describe in the informal community memory centers.
You have 5 minutes left, Christina. 5 minutes more. Yeah.
I'm coming to the questions of our contributors today.
Take your time.
What I really kind of appreciated so much about your article is this point of interaction. So in the barbershop, where the walls are decorated with the sport teams and wedding pictures, there are hardly any captions, as you describe. So they actually cannot be read, they cannot be decoded without the interaction of the customers. So the patrons actually have to tell something about it, they have to point, only then the archives comes to life. And similarly, in the mosque, people kind of use the mosque as the point to talk about their neighborhood and kind of like connect the mosque with pictures in which the mosque features. This point of interaction I find so crucial. And it reminded me of Kate Eichhorn, who has written on the Feminist Archive, has written about the crucial role of finding aids or catalog finding books or indices in the archive, without which we can actually not find anything in the archive. And it seems to be that in your cases, the interactions are these finding aids. So that means if there are no patrons, if there are no believers, you know, the archive cannot speak. And it is actually also not an archive, it's just pictures at the wall. And interactions and encounters are, of course, also key in Nicholas' piece, where actually you say that this is an archive of encounters. So it is an archive of very specific interactions, and in particular of interactions in which you joined the reflexivity of your interlocutors, and where they, because you also talk about how far these. It is really amazing, like how you describe how people were kind of like drawing things for you, or they were writing things down for you. So you talk also about them as lay intellectuals or lay philosophers. So I thought that was really fascinating. But then interaction in a different way, because in a way then it's frozen in these objects, right? So how do we get the interactions and the encounters out of these objects again? What is the finding aid for your archive? Dantje and Caroline, it's also really fascinating to read about provenance research, and also I was very convinced by your by the critique you offer towards provenance research, which assumes the traceability of ownership, and you complicate this, and also you problematize also the notion of involuntary loss of possession as a criterion to actually engage in provenance research. So now I come to the questions I have for all of you. Nina, of course, I invite you to react to what I have said so far, but Nina in particular, I was curious the only time that I was in South Africa and in Cape Town and in Stellenbosch. I visited the District 6 Museum in Cape Town. And as far as I know, it's also a very engaged and collaborative museum. So I was very curious whether you could relate your informal community memory centers to these kind of institutions, which in a way are also official institutions. So how is it similar, but perhaps also different, or how does it resonate with these kind of institutions? But then also, how far could these informal community memory centers be supported or enabled, if not engineered? And how then to work with the problem that every archive, also the archive you are presenting, is excluding somebody. There's always somebody left out. How to reconcile this? Daantje and Caroline, at the end of your article, you refer to, among others, Hartmann and her idea of speculative narration and critical fabulation. And I wanted to invite you to think out loud here, if funding would not be an issue. What could this be in your museums? What would it be, what you would like to put into practice, which could go along those lines? And Nicholas, thinking in particular with Enzo Hamel's piece, who brought Bateson's archive back, and also thinking with Daantje's and Caroline's piece, next to the fact that your archive resonates very much with yourself and your fieldwork memories. And I can relate very much to that. I think many of us who have done ethnography can relate to that. How would you like to archive this archive? Could it be brought back? What would be interesting for your interlocutors? What would it tell later researchers about the encounters, about the relationships? And in particular, what to do about the drawing, the burnt drawing of the devil. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Christine. Very beautiful, inspiring reflections and interesting questions for our presenter. So thank you so much for your discussion of the presentation and the papers. Nina, can I give you the floor first to engage with Christine's questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Christina, for the very well thought out questions and all things I've really been mulling over myself for the past 2 years at least. So your first question, you mentioned you've been to District 6 and even to Stellenbosch, which is interesting, great. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because that was actually in my speech and I had to cut it because I was short on time, which is this phenomenon in South Africa that the forced removals are known, but knowledge about them is centered within urban spaces. So specifically, the two most famous are District 6 in Cape Town, as well as Sophia Town in Johannesburg. And both of these areas from which a lot of people were forcibly removed today contain like a museum, and there's been a lot of memory work, a lot of community work done there. But this has not happened in rural spaces. And a lot of South Africans also, like, a lot of white South Africans have forgotten that this happened everywhere, not just in the big cities. So you asked how Stellenbosch is similar or different to District 6. And I don't have a clear-cut answer for you, but I think the biggest difference is that right when apartheid ended in 1994, there were civil society initiatives pushed by the government in these cities, in these well-known areas that were like urban hubs, to commemorate this history and to make sure it is remembered. And it has been written about by other much more experienced scholars that this kind of emphasis on 1 or 2 urban locations has come to stand in for all the forced removals and all the dislocations that were brought about by the Group Areas Act. And to now, what is it, almost 30 years later, more than 30 years later, in Stellenbosch, try to initiate a museum or a community center like this would be quite a struggle. Not that there isn't initiative, but I feel like the original community which lived in this area has been quite, I mean, with the forced removals, they were split up and completely put in different areas, and the communities were broken up. And often, you know, people my age, grandchildren, I've spoken to people my age who tell me they don't know about these histories because there is so much trauma, and a lot of the more elderly people who experienced it have passed away or simply could not speak about it with their descendants. Which brings me to your next question, was how to sort of support these, what I call informal community memory centers, so like the mosque and like Arts Barbershop. And this is also a difficult question, right? Because again, as a researcher, I cannot prescribe what is best for this community or what is the best way for them to remember this very traumatic history. So I've been exploring with some of my participants like different community initiatives to increase awareness of this. For example, I've been speaking with one, his family was forcibly removed, and he later became a politician, and he's been campaigning for years to get the land back for his family. And he wants to build a sort of memorial center in central Stellenbosch where this history can be commemorated and it can be like a bit of a healing space. And I have like really put myself forward as a researcher on this. But in terms of supporting the actual spaces themselves, so the mosque and arts barbershop, I think as an academic community, it's our job to make ourselves available to what they desire and how they see the future of these spaces, but it's not my place to make those decisions for them. And I also don't feel comfortable saying this should happen or that should happen. So I could very much imagine, for example, with Faisal the barber, we have quite a close relationship now, and I could very much, if we keep our contact going in a few years, see us doing some sort of, for example, digitalization project where together we digitize all the documents and images and paraphernalia in his shop to create some sort of community archive. And he has also indicated that this is something he would be interested in. But in terms of supporting them, the first step I feel is awareness, and just sharing this research with my own sort of white circles in Stellenbosch. People are interested, but they just don't know about it. And kind of telling people about these spaces generates interest in them and generates more people going to them and becoming aware of these stories and meeting these people, and just generates more of a dialogue. And your last question about how every archive is by nature exclusionary and how can we sort of reconcile this? This is also something I struggled with a lot with the digital mapping project, where, for example, my project focuses on colored people to the complete exclusion of Black Stellenboschers, who also make up about 20 to 25% of the population. Yeah, I hate to say it, but at the same time, like, as a researcher, one also needs to make choices, and you cannot archive everything. You need to make decisions about what to include and what to exclude. And at that point in time, I had to limit myself just with my resources and my skills on what I knew, as well as just the fact that I had more contacts within the colored community and not as many within the Black communities of this town. But this is definitely something to keep in mind going forward, because that is a whole another chapter of Stellenbosch's history, which deserves just as equally to be told. And yeah, whether I'm the right person for that remains to be seen, but it's definitely something to be explored. I hope I answered your question somewhat, at least.
Thank you so much, Nina. Caroline and Daantje, can I give you the floor to answer the questions raised by Christine?
Yes, thank you so much. Caroline, shall I just start? You want to start?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think thank you for the very interesting questions as well, and all the previous presentations. It's interesting to see how everyone works in their own discipline and their own expertise, but somehow these things still touch on each other and come together in different ways. I think when we mentioned the critical fabulation as an example, it comes from kind of a desire, that something that we always talked about while working and while doing this type of research. What do you do next? If you enter these archives and you find this information, or you don't, which is also information in a way, and you engage with these archives and you know more about the provenance of a collection, and then what? And I think that's where that idea comes from, about that we had of filling the silences once you address that they are there. And it relates very much to positionality, because at the same time, we don't think it's our position to always be filling those silences, because they're not always our stories to tell. Because it's very much about heritage and colonial history that's not ours. So that's always a bit of a struggle that we find ourselves in. But I think in the end, it really comes down to a wish to work together and engage more in collaborative research, but also shared authority, and see and coming to connection with other ways of doing research and other ways of telling stories. I think one example that I could give, not necessarily at the museum, but I spent several months doing research in Namibia on restitution and provenance research as well, where the people that I engaged with, interacted with, they make me realize that even the museum as a space is a very wide space to be in. So what even is a museum, and then what do you consider a collection or an object, and what is an archive? And it really changed how I started viewing the work that I'm doing here back in the Netherlands. And I think it's about the people who tell the story, but also about having objects tell stories, instead of us telling stories about objects. I think it's about very much about positionality in the end, and about who gets to say what about the collection that we work with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the question is how to bring in people and how to deal with that. How to engage with people from Congo itself, but also with people from diaspora groups in Europe. And I relate very much to what Nina just said about what we can do is make information available. And what we actually wanted to show with our article as well is that there is so much. There are all in the museum. You always have a certain amount of top pieces that are put forward and that generate more research, and you know mass attracts mass, but there is a whole lot of objects that aren't discussed so much, and that it's not known that they're there. And also for in the case of the Congo collection in the Netherlands, it's not very well known that there is a very large and very old Congo collection in the Netherlands. So making that information available and accessible, and creating awareness about these collections in order to generate a dialogue. And I think also the position of the Netherlands, comparing it to Belgium, can where there is a lot of the Wereldmuseum has a lot of different collections to work on, and there is a lot of air in the conversation, whereas in Belgium, because of the formal colonized relation, I think it's more a suffocated discussion. So I think it would be beautiful to develop that in the Wereldmuseum, and it's not always in our practices enough, but when visiting the museum, the depot with people from the Congolese diaspora, it is things wake up, and so I think it's important to talk around the objects, because the questions are different, obviously, and the interests are different.
Okay, thank you so much, Caroline and Daantje. Nicolas, can I give you the floor?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Christina, for your very generous readings of all of our articles, and thank you for the wonderful questions. How would you archive the archive? I mean, my immediate answer is that I don't know, really. I haven't properly thought about it. I suppose a logical home for it would be in perhaps a university department. But then, as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, what would be the point of that, right? Why? Because it would take up space, and I suppose two things pop to mind. Of course, at one level, it reveals the materiality and the material culture of a particular religious community at a particular time in a particular place. It only really makes sense, because you asked about my interlocutors, it only really makes sense outside of that context, right? There's something about the transferal of that stuff into a different place that makes it meaningful as an archive, because back in Serbia, it seems to be that's just paper that's constantly in circulation and people read it and throw it away. So there's something about the movement of that, the sort of, I don't know, sort of a Nancy Munn style thing, you know, moving one place to another, and that generates value. I think there's something like that going on. So yeah, at one level, it would tell us something about, you know, the materiality of Orthodox Serbs in the post-Milosevic period when I was doing research. And I suppose at another level, it would tell, I don't know, anthropology undergraduates of the future about how anthropologists in the past produced knowledge and how they went about their fieldwork and how they collected things. I'm not sure whether anybody's had the chance to go through Malinovsky's own archives at the LSE, but this is possible to do. And I was doing some work for a colleague in the US, so it wasn't actually my project, but he was telling me what he wanted. And my lord, that guy saved everything. You know, you think I'm bad. He saved every single receipt, every single letter, every single note. But it's fascinating to look through, because not only are we learning about his ideas about culture and theory, we're learning about how a particular man produced knowledge in a particular historical moment. So maybe my archive would be interesting in that sense, that people could look back and say, oh yeah, back in, you know, the 2020s, that's how some ethnographers were creating knowledge, in a sort of history of knowledge style optic. And then you asked the brilliant question, what about the burnt picture of the devil? And for those of you who haven't read the article, on one occasion, quite a drunken night, I was in conversation with some of my interlocutors, and one of them decided to tell me about his encounter with the devil. And I asked him what it was like. How did that manifest? How did the devil manifest itself? And he started drawing a picture. And perhaps on a more sober occasion, I would have said it looked like a sort of Alsatian dog or a fox, but this was the devil. And of course, my ethnographer's beady eye leapt upon this little piece of paper, and I said, "Oh, could I have that picture of the devil?" And he whisked it away, and burnt it with his cigarette lighter, and it just crumbled away. But that image stayed in my mind, and I can see it really clearly, but I'm not quite sure what to do with it. I included it in my, I sort of feel that it's emotionally included in my archive, or in my mind's eye, but it doesn't, no photograph exists, no physical trace exists. So I suppose the message there is that sometimes people don't want you to archive stuff because of its spiritual capacities. The reasoning was that if I'd retained that, I would be able to use this to summon the devil, and that would be very dangerous for me and those around me. So there's a broader point there about the fact that not everything, you know, people don't like their stuff being archived sometimes, and there might be much bigger, you know, cosmological reasons, spiritual reasons as to why that may be so. But it's an open question. I thank you for asking it. I included it because I wanted to, but as I was writing the conclusion, I was really struggling to try and work out how it fitted in. Only I just felt that it should be there. Thank you again for your questions.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. Christine, I don't know if you would like to share a final reflection or observation after hearing these answers or replies to your questions.
I would actually like to address Rune with the last question, because I mean, we were hearing people also being very wary of not speaking for others, but then also recognizing the need to represent the collection. And I think that is also something you kind of pointed towards, that one needs to understand the archival structure. That in itself is also interesting information, as you also just heard from Nicolas. So I was wondering whether you would like to reflect on this. And I'm particularly interested in what you told us about that you have to translate to capture or anticipate the questions from people, and whether you could tell us something about finding aids, because as I understood it, as archivists, you also develop them.
Thanks so much.
Yes. thank you, Christina, for the question as well. Well, let's just say it's very interesting hearing all these all these very interesting topics, lectures on archives from someone who has a more practical hands-on experience with archives herself. I think archives, I see archives personally as a kind of tomb. I think it was also said in the article, the first article, who said it? I think Mbembe said the archive was a tomb or a temple. And I personally see, the way I see the archive is like a tomb where information is kept, but not a closed off tomb. So people can still access it, but it's only valued when people actually come and enter. Well, mostly obviously only the reading room, because I think 5% of our archives is digitized, even though we digitize our archives every day. So that's also something to think about when it comes to accessibility. I think the role of the archive is differs for everyone. I think it's mostly just I think it exists for citizens, for researchers, but I think the archives themselves try to sort of distance themselves from their own collections, if that makes sense. In the sense that archives are an institution. I think I've forgotten the question, Christina. These are just my own reflections on everything we've heard. I think Nicholas, you were mentioning things like the Ethnographer's Archive. There are actually ethnographers' archives in the Utrecht archives as well, as part of Utrecht University archives. So within university archives, you can find old transcripts of anthropologists, I think from the 20th century. I think so. Yeah, you can actually find those things and as part of university archives. Yeah, and yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think I lost my train of thought a bit, but it was all very interesting, and yeah, I think archives should be doing a lot more in the sense that creating community and being a space for everyone, but I don't see it happening in practice, at least not within the institution of the archive, because of money. Practical funding is just very hard to get by. But yeah, maybe one small example, maybe that's can help.
And after that, I'm going to ask you to round up, but please continue, because then we still have time for questions. But please continue with your example.
Just one example is I started working at the Utrecht Archives as an intern, and I did it with a missionary archive, of which I already also showed one picture. These pictures are part of the Moravian Church, who did a lot of missionary work to Suriname, and there was like a community of Auken, Maroon community the foundation Wokomokandi. They came to the Utrecht archives and they wanted to do something with these pictures because they were very valuable. However, they weren't digitized yet, and also the archive itself didn't really know a lot about these pictures, so we needed the foundation Wokomokandi of the Maroon community to come and give us some more information. And we found a really nice record, but it was only found accessed by searching on the words bosland, so forest land. The place where the Maroon community lived is the inland of Suriname, but the missionary workers only categorized it under the name bosland. And this was the only word, thousands of stories could be accessed is by searching and trying accessing only by that word. So this maybe gives a small information of why the archives aren't really accessible, and you need a lot of curiosity and time and energy to actually find all those hundreds of thousands of stories that are behind those walls. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Aruna, for these reflections. Nice to have you back in the conversation. So now I would like to open up the floor for for questions from the other participants. I think we are not that many people, so I think you can just open your microphone, and if you don't want to, you can also put a question in the chat. Yeah, Rebecca, please go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a few questions for everyone. I wrote them down. They're a bit disordered, but they're all in order of who I'm asking, so I hope that's okay. I think for a little bit of background about the root of the questions, I am an Indigenous researcher based in the Netherlands. So my mom is Native American and my dad is Irish. And I did my degree in anthropology at the VU in Amsterdam, and I'm starting my master's at the VU in Amsterdam as well. So on cultural anthropology. So that's a little bit of context about where these questions are rooted. Is I work very closely as an Indigenous person operating in this kind of Western field and surrounded by a very Western white colleagues. And so my first question was for Nina. And I was thinking about when you talked about collaboration and how that's like the only way to really like end exploitation. I wonder if you really think that's like the limit, or if it, for me, like I always try to think about when I'm doing research in my own community, I'm aware that all of the research I conduct through the VU is in some way exploitive because it's a Dutch university and it's a European foundation. So I always try to really balance the extraction with reciprocity. And so that's very rooted. And so when I go back home, obviously I'm also going home to visit my relatives, so it's different, but I bring gifts, I bring food, I bring, money. I try to connect people into professional opportunities because I'm getting professional opportunities, like that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering how far you can see that kind of reciprocity being pushed in the specific context of your research. So
Yeah, thank
that
you.
was my first question. Yeah.
But maybe Rebecca, maybe you can post your questions first, and then we go over to the answers. Is that okay for you?
That's perfect. If
Okay.
that's okay for everyone else. My next question was for Dante and Caroline. Yeah. And I was gonna say that in your answer to Christine's question, I think, where you said that you thought the discussion about the Belgian Congo and colonialism in that aspect was kind of like suppressed and suffocated. Do you see that reflected in the Dutch archives in a different way? Because for me, I would say that those conversations are still kind of suffocated in the Netherlands in a lot of ways. And so I would be interested to see how you would kind of compare and contrast the quote unquote, you know, the suffocation in Belgium versus the Dutch way of kind of, yeah. So I just thought about, you know, and then I thought about for further steps, are you thinking about taking the opportunity to connect with diaspora and bring them into the archive and have them, you know, give that context, the cultural context, but also to be able to embrace and honor their relatives and their ancestors in that way? I think that's a super important thing that hasn't happened a lot at Dutch museums. So I would very much say that I don't know if you see that as a possibility moving forward, but I think it would be a really interesting thing to hear your thoughts about, you know, connecting with the diaspora community like that and bringing them physically into that space to bring the cultural, sorry, I'm going to say it like a bit not very Western, but I'm going to say to bring their relatives home and to bring their relatives their good medicine and their culture and to bring that back to them, which I think is a fantastic way to honor, especially when our non-human relatives and our relatives that are deemed objects by museums are left in archives. I think it's really important to care for them and take care of them in that way. Yeah, Nicholas, I wanted to ask about, you were talking about the picture of the burning picture of the devil, and I really like the way you talk about it. And I wonder if, because you said there's no documentation about it, there's no photo, there's no evidence. Would you not say that a vignette that you would write would be evidence enough? And I think that in that vignette, you painted your evidence and created it yourself. And I would argue that evidence is better and more respectful of the cultural, sociocultural boundaries that are enforced by the people. And I think about, when I think about private archives, and I'm the same way, I'm a collector, you know, my sister likes to regularly remind me that I'm a hoarder. She recently had to help me move and she was not pleased. But with that context, I'm very aware of old collections of, you know, very, you know, the Dutch Golden Age and the cabinets of curiosities that were built, and how we can manage our own curiosity and our love and our passion for what we're collecting, but also, you know, being able to maintain those boundaries and that respect. And I would argue that that vignette is the perfect way to do it. And, you know, it's not the physical ephemera, but you can always print it out. But I would be, but I would be interested to hear, you know, more thoughts about, you know, how you view boundaries and how you see them in, because again, I can always kind of connect with the mysticism, and I can say, yeah, that totally makes sense why he would not want you to summon the devil. But also I can understand where, as an anthropologist, I would love to have that piece of paper as well. And so I think about that balance of boundaries and how do you negotiate that in your own personal collection, or if you do at all, or if you are just like, I'm going to hoard everything, which is understandable as well. I get it. But yeah, and then Runa, I had one question for you, and I was thinking about where you were like, the archive struggles to change, like it should adapt, and it, you know, and I recognize this cognitive dissonance a lot in kind of Dutch academia as a whole, where there's almost this separation from its own legacy and its own lessons. And so I think about it, you know, there's the distance from your own collection in that way, but I think there's also the context always in it, you know, that there's always the colonial context that comes in, because that is so that there's no, you can't have Dutch history without colonial history. And I think that to me is so important to drive home in that way. And I think about it a lot when I think when, you know, because you know, there's a rainbow dream catcher hanging behind you. That's another instance of how those kinds of conversations manifest differently in different cultures. And I see it especially in the Netherlands. And so I wonder what your take on, if this is a Dutch issue, if this is an archival issue, if this is a European issue. I would really like to hear that, because again, I'm an anthropologist. This is really a little outside of my realm, but I'm really enjoying it. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope I didn't annoy you too much with my rambling questions, but yes, thank you.
No, thank you so much, Rebecca, for bringing in this perspective. I just want to check if there are any other questions at this moment, so we can collect them for now. Is there anyone who would like to add a question to the questions asked by Rebecca at this moment? Okay, well, I think we will have some time after this round as well. Nina, can I give you the floor again?
Yes, thank you so much for the brilliant questions, Rebecca. And you touch on a lot of really, really important points there. So I'll start with this question of reciprocity and kind of, isn't all knowledge creation extractive, especially like in my situation where I am very much operating as a researcher within this environment and an urban landscape that is still, you know, fully living the long-term effects of apartheid. Like South Africans, well, progressive South Africans often say apartheid is legally over, but physically it's not over. Like you walk around South African cities and you will see how segregated it still is. And this was, something I'm still struggling with, to be honest with you. In the beginning, when I started doing the original project, so the digital map, I was limited by funds, and I explained to a couple of interviewees what was possible, and they said, oh, it would be nice to have something digital to maybe get the young people in our community interested. So that was my reasoning for doing this sort of digital interactive map. But to be honest with you, it didn't achieve the reach that I hoped it did. And since then, like I said, I've kind of kept those relationships alive, which has sort of triggered a different conundrum where I came into this community as a master's student in a relationship where this kind of knowledge creation I was doing is extractive. But in the process, you build these relationships with people and you get to know them, and they also get to know what you're capable of. And now I desperately want to go on with this work and do a much larger project. And I have a lot of people that are waiting for me to come back and willing to help me and are offering to set up focus groups, and I can't find funding. And this feels terrible because the people who have these memories are dying. I was there in December, and one of my main informants, who's a community elder, she passed away at the age of 95. And I met with the family, and I was just saying, it's like a library has burned down. And they, in their own words, they do not have the time or the resources or frankly the skills to put this information together and kind of do this research work. And that it's not forthcoming from the local university is shocking in and of itself. But that aside, I am fully on board with you that knowledge creation is extractive, but I do believe it can also be mutually beneficial. For me, as a white Stellenboscher, wanting to make my hometown, which I love and at the same time hate, a more welcoming place for all of its, all the people who come from there and who live there, as well as for these communities who, like just for them to be recognized and for people who visit Stellenbosch to also know that it's not just the sort of, Eurocentric colonial narratives, that all of this is also very much part of the story and that they contributed as much. So in that way, I don't think it's always extractive. I think it can be very much a building up and a strengthening of the sort of local, all the different communities that live within this urban space. That was a little bit of a rant now, but hope it answered your question somewhat.
Thank you, Nina.
That's amazing. Sorry,
important rant. Daantje and Caroline.
Shall I take the first question, Daantje? Yeah. Rebecca, thank you so much for those great questions and for listening so carefully. I think there is a big difference between Belgium and the Netherlands in more than one respect. There's a whole different. I think I wanted to talk about three aspects, like the law, archives, and collections. But I think I'd like to start with the collections and museums because there's a whole different culture in Belgium. So the main collection that we're focusing on in Belgium is the collection of the Africa Museum in Tervuren, and in the 70s, Mobutu was already making requests for restitutions, and since then, so there was like 100 objects were restituted, but they were sold or lost. So that gives a difficult story to the concept of restitution. And from that moment onwards, actually no catalogs were produced anymore about the collection, so that there is no the knowledge or the access about collections was not produced in the same way as in other places. And you can still see it with how long it took to make a digital collection database, which is for the Netherlands, for example, everything is relatively accessible. And within the current African Museum, there's still very much visions, opposed visions towards restitution, towards working with diaspora groups, the value of that. So I think this is not so much the case in the Wereldmuseum, which is the biggest ethnographic museum in the Netherlands, where there are countless initiatives that were started with different. The collections come from everywhere in the world in the Wereldmuseum, which is different context to the African Museum. And so experiences are exchanged with different people from the whole world. So I think there is a definite difference there. And then I'm working on restitution, so I have all these restitution examples. But the law in Belgium, there is a restitution law that requires a bilateral treaty. So we're very proud that there is a law, but it needs a treaty. So in practice, there is a lot of boundaries to execute the law. So we can say that there is a pioneering law that allows for restitution, but there is all these conditions that make it impossible. Whereas in the Netherlands, there is no law, there is just a policy, and people were afraid that it would not be sufficient because it's only a policy, and that under the current government wouldn't continue. But actually we see a case law build up, and there is a gradual know-how that is being built up, because restitution is a relatively new thing, and you can see how the policy was first for the formal colonies of the Netherlands, but then restitutions happened towards it made it broader and more nuanced. So you can see how it's taking form, and I think it's really lovely to see how that's going. And then for archives, it's the Netherlands aren't perfect, but in comparison, we had an elevator problem in Belgium, which seems very banal, but it actually stopped the archives from being used in between August and December. So all the foreign researchers from Congo, from America, they all had to be, they couldn't do what they were meant to do here, because there is a whole system where you have to write out an official, we need a lift fixer, and in Belgium, it needs to be equally to the French and the Belgian, and it's the whole administrative thing that made that the lift couldn't be repaired. And the same goes for the digital accessibility of archives, for the everything that has been declassified now has to be inventory, it has to be keywords have to be added to it so that it becomes searchable. And this is really not the case in the Netherlands. It's basically Google if you go to the National Archives. It's a real difference. I'm not trained as a historian, and I can just sorry.
Caroline, can I ask you to? I love your enthusiasm.
Thank you. Sorry. I can go on for hours.
Yeah, I
sorry,
could sense that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing in this perspective and showing us sharing your passion with us. But I thought Daantje also had a question to answer, right? That you, Daantje?
Sure. Yeah, the second question, I think. Thank you very much. I think about connecting or building relationships with people in the diaspora, communities of origin is what they're often referred to, countries of origin, when we're talking about museum collections and heritage. or anyone who might feel a personal connection to the collections that are looked after in the Netherlands. I think it's one of the most crucial things in the work that we do. And there have been a lot of efforts in recent years where you can see there's an increasing engagement with people who want to know what's in the collection. And I think it's honest to say that the museum tries and not always succeeds. And there could definitely be more efforts. I think Caroline and I, we've worked together for over 2 years, and a lot of the time we were wondering why we were the ones doing this kind of work, and why, if we were doing it in the right way. And these reflections, yeah, we talked about this a lot, and it's difficult. I think that's the most honest answer I can give to your question. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing happening, but it could always be better and could always be more. At the same time, the World Museum exists of like 3 institutions. One of them is in 3 formerly independent museums, and one of them is in Rotterdam, where we were based. 80,000 objects, or artifacts, whatever you want to refer to. The 3 institutions together, they look after 450,000 objects in total. And when we look at objects in the collection, sometimes all that we know is it comes from Africa. So it doesn't have a country or a name or a region or anything, that we don't even know the collector. We come across those kind of cases. So who do you reach out to in that case? And I think that we're at a point where we start wondering about these kind of complicated cases, I think. But these things take time as well. Yeah, I think that will be my answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again for this question, Rebecca. Nicolas, can I pass it on to you?
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Rebecca, for your very thoughtful and kind engagement with the paper. I really like what you said. Yeah, the vignette itself is sort of the product is a sort of evidence, right? I thought that was very nicely formulated, and I suppose you could make that argument of ethnographic vignette writing more generally, right? It's the production of some sort of evidence. So I'm glad you thought it came across as respectful, because of course there's always that challenge of how to write about people who draw pictures of the devil after having had a few bottles of wine and tell you about their encounter with it, without sounding sneering or rational, and allowing the possibility for that to be completely real. So it's always a challenge writing, in English, how to capture that, right? So I'm pleased if you thought that worked. And you asked about respect and how to draw boundaries. Well, I suppose everything that I've collected was either in the public sphere or for sale or just at the back of a church to take, or it was given to me, or I asked to take it, right? And in some occasions people are like, why would you want to take that? But I wasn't surreptitiously taking things, or sneaking stuff away, or taking stuff without people's consent, let's say. But the bigger ethical question that I have at the moment these days is actually what to do with a lot of the books that I've given, because I am deluged, and I think that's the proper word, deluged with like obscure theological books, and they're always, thick, and I'm fascinated in religion and so on. There's no way I'm going to read all of those, and I really don't have the space physically, right? Nor the strength to carry them around. So the actual challenge that I've been dealing with is what to do with all these obscure tracts that are not just about theology, but are written in Serbian, in Cyrillic, and they're now in London. So I've started trying to bequeath them to the Serbian Orthodox Church in London, because there's of course no way that I can throw them away, but there isn't necessarily a big readership outside of central Serbia for those sort of books, and I just don't have the space. So that's actually the sort of the ethical conundrum I'm facing at the minute. But yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. And Rune, can I invite you to close Yes. You started and you are the final one to say something. That's beautiful. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, as well, for your thoughtful questions for everyone. Your question to me was more about how an archive distances itself from its collection, and if I see it as a particular Dutch, well, a Dutch problem or more of a European problem. I think I'm not the right person to answer that question, because I don't really know enough about European archival culture in that sense. But I think, well, archives are built on power dynamics. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. Dutch history is always connected to colonial history, you said, and I think I can sort of agree on that, in the sense that archives are created in the 19th century, or at least everything is built around power dynamics and from a specific point of view, and even archives from the Middle Ages or the 12th century, for example, they are also created within a framework that's built in colonial times. So in that sense, yes, I personally, I kind of agree with you on that sense. That's yeah, the persons who collected the documents and made it into records were people existed within a specific framework in colonial times. Yeah, and who decided to keep and what to keep and what to destroy. That's also interesting to keep in mind when you do archival research. And today you need to document what you decide to destroy. So I think that's quite important to also say that there is the Archiefwet, the Dutch Archival Act today. Within there is a framework, but yeah, and once archived, it's almost impossible to get rid of the records today. So that's also interesting. Yeah, but I think it's always important to keep in mind where you do research when you enter an archive.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rune. And with these words, we have reached the end of this webinar, I guess. I would like to thank everyone for attending, for presenting, for asking. It has been really inspiring also for me. I will go back to the articles though, because when you are watching the time, it's more difficult to listen very intensely. But thank you so much. And I think I would like to hand it back to Julian for some closing goodbyes, or I don't know. We didn't really discuss
thank
this.
you. I don't need a lot. I don't need to say a lot, but it was a very interesting webinar with beautiful presentations. And thank you so much, Elisabeth, also for moderating, and Christine for your generous response. We will be having another webinar next. I don't know when precisely, but we will keep you updated through our channels of the Neva and Etnofoor. But thank you for signing up, listening, and you can still read the archive, our special issue on the website, or order a physical copy. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.